Hello and welcome to UK Low Carb, and what a special show it is because I'm joined by the legend herself, Nina Teicholz. Welcome, Nina, to UK Low Carb. It is brilliant to have you here.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm really pleased to be here with you.
Yeah, great. And I said I was really anxious trying to get time zones correct, but we managed to make it. It's been pouring down with rain out here. It's actually terrified we're going to have like a power cut with the thunder and lightning, but we've managed to get it, which is great. And it's so good to have you on the show. And I just wanted to start really, because I know that this is a topic that I didn't know. Okay, I just need to let you know the influence you've had on me firstly. So when I read your book, The Big Fat Surprise, I was actually pretty ignorant to most of this stuff, and I think yours was the book that opened up my eyes to so much with regards to nutrition science and to what we always hear people quoting and telling us all the time. And it was really your narrative that I loved, that instead of, like, you know, some doctors and scientists looking at very particular areas, you could give me the whole kind of narrative of how this story had unfolded and how I guess these belief systems had been created. And so I really wanted to start by asking about Ancel Keys, because that was probably to me the most interesting thing, that this man had such big influence. So I guess the question's got to be, who was he and how did he have such a huge influence on what we do today?
Well, first, thank you for those nice comments about my book. I'm glad you liked it. I researched that book for almost a decade and read tens of thousands of papers and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of researchers. And I slowly came to understand that there was this central figure in this story, really one man, Ancel Keys, a pathologist at the University of Minnesota, whose science had shaped so much of what we believe today. We still believe today. These ideas that saturated fats are bad for health, that overall fat might be bad for health, that cholesterol, eating any dietary cholesterol like egg yolks, that was bad for health. All that came from this idea that Ancel Keys hatched in the 1950s. And so I started to focus really on him and his role. He was this overpowering personality. I mean, even his friends would say that he could argue anyone to the death, that it was just impossible to win an argument with him because he—
And that's his friends.
Those were his friends. Like the energy, the vociferousness of his arguments is that he would bring, the passion that he would bring, the innate sense that he had that he was right and no one could prove him wrong. And he had this sort of anti-scientific view that he was right until proven wrong. You know, I mean, all of science, the whole idea of science, from Karl Popper on, is the idea that you have a hypothesis and then you can slowly accrue evidence to sort of support that hypothesis, but it could, you know, theoretically always be proven wrong. But Ancel Keys had the opposite approach, which was I'm right until proven wrong. And his idea was the diet heart hypothesis, that saturated fat and cholesterol, if you ate them, they would raise your cholesterol in your blood. And then that cholesterol, he literally thought to visualize that, like cholesterol kind of closing up your arteries until they clogged them. And then you would, you know, have a heart attack and die. Right. And he came to this theory, you know, through honest experimentation. He saw that people built up cholesterol plaques in their hands and through they're called xanthomas, and he sort of assumed like that is the same thing that's happening inside our bodies in our arteries, which turns out not to be true, but that was what he thought. How did he become so influential? Well, it was this incredible force of personality that he was able to insert himself into the right places. And one of those places was that he befriended the personal doctor of President Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower in the US, and went and took this doctor all over Europe with him and said, look, the people eating the fatty food are having heart attacks, and the people eating mostly, you know, vegetables and very little meat are not having heart attacks. And this is, of course, after World War II, when, you know, people were not eating their normal diets and millions of people had been displaced, and many, you know, countries that had lost the war, like, you know, in the Mediterranean, they were subsisting on food that they had not normally eaten. But in any case, the key event was President Eisenhower having his heart attack in 1955. He's out of his office for 10 days, and the whole nation is in a panic about what causes heart disease. And enters the doctor taking care of the president. And he, persuaded by Ancel Keys, says, look, he's had this heart attack because of diet. He needs to go on a diet of Melba toast and have margarine instead of butter. And, let's ignore the fact that he's smoking about 4 or 5 packs of cigarettes every day. Everybody was focused on diet because, this was a time, the larger picture is this nation in a panic about the rising tide of heart disease, which had rates of which had been almost zero in the early 1900s and had quickly risen to become the nation's #1 killer by the 1950s. And nobody knows what caused.
I didn't realize this at the time. So this is what I find interesting now that I've kind of embraced low carb and keto, and I've learned from talking to people like yourself that actually this is a modern disease that you just wouldn't have seen, like these people's parents and their grandparents wouldn't have had this, and then suddenly fit-ish as we thought people were suddenly dying of coronary heart disease, which must have been quite a shock.
It is completely fascinating to us contemporary creatures that we were not always so sick. It's almost impossible to conceive of that the world was not there. Not everyone knew, like everybody they knew was dying of cancer or had cancer or everybody had heart disease or, much less everybody's on a statin, or that obesity and diabetes are so prevalent. I mean, until the 20th century, until early 1900s, these diseases were all exceedingly rare. And it's not that doctors didn't know them. They would, they understood what cancer was. They had seen a few cases. They would go particularly to populations that still had their original, let's say, primitive diets, but let's say untouched by modern processed foods. And they could not find any instances of cancer at all in these populations. And they couldn't find heart disease. I mean, I write about in my book that this big, huge hospital in Boston with one of the premier experts on heart disease, they just didn't see. They saw like a few cases of heart disease a year. So this was just not the environment that people lived in. People died of other things like tuberculosis and communicable diseases, but they didn't live with the kind of sickness that we live with. And actually, it's kind of an interesting side little fact. But go back and read your 19th century literature, and like people are, does it? You don't read about people die of old age.
The consumption you heard about, wasn't it? The consumption was quite after, which is, I guess, TB, isn't it? Which is quite a common death, but certainly not. You never hear about coronary heart disease at all, do you?
Well, it was very rare, and so it's really hard to imagine. So that it's a little bit like, I would think, like we live with now with COVID, and we don't really know exactly where it came from or how to prevent it, and we're in a moment of a public health panic that is, let's say, somewhat similar to what people were experiencing in the 1950s. We're like, well, why is my father, at age 55, why did he die? So there were a number of theories about what caused heart disease that were competing at the time. Some thought that it was vitamin deficiency. Others thought that it was the rising tide of auto exhaust with the increased number of cars on the road. Others thought it was a type A personality, that you run around screaming at everybody and then, you would just keel over of a heart attack. But it was Ancel Keys who successfully entered that vacuum, that need for explanation. And he proposed his theory. He had persuaded Dwight Eisenhower's doctor, and then he managed to sort of elbow his way onto the nutrition committee of the American Heart Association, which was the premier organization in the country and still is on providing people advice about heart disease. It was an association of cardiologists, sort of a new profession at the time, relatively new. And he was able to get his idea implanted into the American Heart Association such that in 1961, despite a paucity of evidence, this group issued the first ever warning anywhere in the world, telling at that time just men to not eat saturated fat and dietary cholesterol, instead of butter to have margarine, instead of meat to have, some other substitute, have low fat milk, low fat cheese, all of that originated in 1961 with this first ever official declaration, which was Ancel Keys's idea. Just a year earlier, the American Heart Association was saying, basically, we'd love to tell you what to do to prevent heart disease, but we don't know. And then a year later,
we now know.
Virtually the force of Ancel Keys' personality, with no greater data, they made this proclamation. And that was really, sort of the nub of an idea that grew into this giant, tangled web that we have today of all these recommendations all over the world telling us virtually the same thing. I mean, there has been some evolution, and we can talk about that, but this idea, certainly the idea that saturated fat is bad for you in terms of cardiovascular disease is one that still is really entrenched in authorities and in everyone's minds. Although there's less evidence today than there was back when Ancel Keys suggested it.
So let's just break down then. So, because I'm not a scientist, so do you want to just tell me what was his job again? Did you say at the university beforehand? Is he a scientist himself or not?
So yes, he is. He's he actually had 2 PhDs, but I'm not sure I think he was trained as in oceanography, and then he was I forget the other one. I'm just spacing for a moment, but he was very educated, but the work he was doing was actually not in the fields in which he'd been trained. He was doing little experimental trials on very small groups of people, men, and feeding them fats, different kinds of dietary fats, and then looking at how that affected their total cholesterol, which is the only thing that you could measure at the time.
Right.
He had previously done an experiment for which he's very well known, which was a starvation experiment on men who didn't want to go to war, and so instead were volunteered for these trials. And he looked into how people recover, how they deal with starvation, and then how they recover from it. But then he did these, really a series of small studies looking at fat and cholesterol, and based on those sort of small experiments that were, in my opinion, not very well conducted, he sort of formed his theory. And in fact, the evidence was so sort of thin and uncertain that his first hypothesis was that it was fat overall that caused heart disease. But then he refined that and said it was just saturated fat. So that instead of saturated fat, So
it's actually all fat at first, and then he chose the saturated. But then, is that on a whim? I mean, is this because of the 7-country study, the 7 countries? I mean, is this why saturated fat became the thing, or was it that he decided that was the theory, and then the 7 countries was going to just back that up?
Right. Well. So his first evidence base were these small experimental studies that he had done, and then he had done some observations in places like Italy and Greece and other countries where he had gone and seen what people ate, and in some cases took information about their cholesterol and their heart attacks. So he did some pilot studies, let's say. And then he designed this huge study called the 7-country study, which was mainly in Europe, but also in the US and Japan. And as we understand it, he had already formed in his mind this idea at that point when he started the 7-country study that it was fat that caused heart disease. So he set off to try to prove that. I don't know exactly what point that he flipped to fingering just saturated fats. His experiment, took 10-15 years in order to, they took data from nearly 13,000 men, all men. That would not really be acceptable in today's world. Yeah. He took data on what they ate on a very small sample of them. It was too small to be a representative sample. And then he followed them, measured their cholesterol, and he then followed them to see, which of them had a heart attack or died or got cancer or whatever. And he did set out to, I think, prove his hypothesis. And the evidence that we have of this, if you're a scientist who's approaching your subject honestly, you try to approach, you try to be as unbiased as possible. But I think the reason that we know that Ancel Keys was in fact trying to prove a hypothesis when he started out was that it is really, I think, a fair statement to say that he cherry-picked his countries that he studied. He had known from his pilot studies that places like France, Switzerland, Germany, those countries ate a lot of saturated fat, omelets, sausages, but they had very low rates of heart disease. So including those countries would have disproven Ancel Keys'
cut
hypothesis.
them, get rid of them, move them aside. Let's just ignore those.
He did not include those countries in his study. And he instead included countries where he knew that people did not eat a lot of saturated fats and had low rates of heart disease. Why did they not eat a lot of saturated fats? Because they were the losers in World War II, and they had, their food supplies were depleted. Millions of people had left Italy and Greece and emigrated because one of the reasons was they had no food. So he was, he did set up the study in a way that enabled him to sort of prove his hypothesis. So that's why, I think it can be said he cherry-picked. I mean, in response to that, one of his co-authors, Henry Blackburn, who is still living at the University of Minnesota, he said, well, it was just that those were the countries that we went to, the countries that we were able to work with, where we had colleagues, where they were able to offer support. Well, that may be very well true, but it is still true that they did not include any countries that would have contradicted their their hoped for findings.
Yeah, and as a Catholic growing up, I know what Lent was like, and I know that you said in Greece, of course, it was one of the studies was done during Lent. So of course, fish was going to be consumed a lot more, meat a lot less. Because of course that's a period of abstinence, isn't it? Which many people would have followed back then.
Yeah, that was one of the little gems that I discovered in my research, which was that he had visited each country, each location 3 times, and one of those locations was Crete. And in one of the weeks that he went there, it was during Lent. And the Greek Orthodox Lent is a very strict one, according to historical documents, that they, I think, do not even allow fish, so that you cannot eat any animal products of any kind. But they, and so Keys would have, of course, undercounted the amount of animal foods these people were eating, but he sort of dismisses that in his manuscript and doesn't acknowledge it as a factor that would have affected his results.
Wow. So this is the thing that I've learned as well. The whole idea of how science works, the pyramid, there are some ways of doing science which are, I guess, we're going to give you more accurate results than others. And the way that I've kind of understood epidemiology, which I know we can talk about in a moment, which is what he uses, is a bit like saying sunstroke causes sunburn, because there's a high correlation between sunstroke and sunburn. So obviously in epidemiology, sunstroke causes sunburn. That's kind of an example of how it can be used to show something that's completely not right, isn't it? And
yes.
So and just want to break that down for listeners and viewers, that he is doing that same thing, saying in these countries, this happens. So that must mean that's the causation of this thing that happens in that country as well, without being able to prove the link, which seems quite fundamental to me in science. How come governments would just effectively say within a few years, yeah, okay, I think you're correct? That's incredible.
Well, I mean, you put your finger on one of the central problems in nutrition science even today, which is that there are, just to be simple about it, there are basically 2 kinds of studies. One kind of study only shows association between things. So as you say, Dan, there's, sunstroke and sunburn. One does not cause the other, but they are associated with each other, right? And these kinds of, and so the 7-country study was a study that showed an association, but not causation, right? Yep. And then there's, normally in normal science, epidemiology will turn up these kinds of associations, and then they'll say, right, well, that's the first step of science. The next step of science is to do a randomized controlled clinical trial. And that is the kind of science that can show cause and effect. Right? I won't get into all the details, but if you remember with the vaccines that we've all recently taken, there was a hesitancy about even conditionally improving them until there had been a randomized controlled clinical trial. We're not allowed to receive, any kind of drug, any kind of treatment in the normal medical world until there has been a randomized controlled clinical trial. There's just not population-wide recommendations made on the basis of these associations, because they are often, it could be association, it could be a cause and effect, but most often they're not. Like, to give you an example, one of the biggest databases for this kind of associational data, it's called epidemiology or observational data. It resides at Harvard, and there was once a study of all the associations that had been published by Harvard, that taking vitamin E would prevent heart disease or antioxidants, or that hormone replacement therapy would prevent heart disease, or that all these different antioxidants that they tested, and maybe all these recommendations to take all these pills. Well, when they finally, and some of this became policy, right? Like hormone replacement therapy, based simply on those associational findings. When they tested them in clinical trials, 100% of them turned out to be wrong.
Wow.
And it's just the nature of the field, right?
Who takes responsibility for that? Who puts their hands up to say, sorry guys, we made you change your life and maybe it damaged you or killed you because the way we gave advice, but it wasn't correct? I mean, is anyone accountable in this stuff? I
think really the sad answer is no.
Oh my word.
Really the answer is that it's there's really, who would want to stand up in the government who's recommended it, or the university professors who published it and lobbied hard for it? There really is, there's very little, eating crow. I would say that it has taken thus far journalists in the field really to kind of hold the epidemiologist's feet to the fire. It's not the way the world should function, but when I think about who's written the critical works and books and articles, it's all been journalists.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting that you and Gary Taubes have come in as complete neutrals, which I think actually helps the fact that you went in there completely. In fact, you're a vegetarian, weren't you, at the time when you started looking into this?
Yeah, well, I was not eating red meat. I wasn't eating, full fat dairy. I was eating like very few animal foods. And I don't even know why. I just thought it would make me healthier. I hadn't really looked into any literature. It's just that ambient thing. Like, you're like, oh, well, I'll just do that because then I'll be thinner and healthier.
Well, to be fair, the government guidelines become the norm, and they become the kind of I guess the shared belief you have. So people can't say why something's healthy, but they just know it is. And I guess that's exactly what happened to you in that instance. You thought something was healthy without researching at the time, because that's what the belief was. And I guess that influences all of us in that way, doesn't it?
I think, like most people, I wanted to believe my doctor, and I wanted to believe the health authorities, and I had no reason to doubt them. And I think, like most people, I think I'm stupider than most people, because I just would carry on with this advice. Well, I think it is a common story, right? You carry on, you try harder and harder, you carry on with the advice, you exercise more, you eat more fruits and vegetables, and I just found myself being sicker and fatter, and it didn't work for me, but I kept thinking it was something wrong with me. And then when I finally started reading the literature, which I did because it had been assigned to me as a magazine article, I was just so dazzled. I think it's a common experience that people have. And one thing that, I went down the rabbit hole, obviously. I've spent so many years researching for this book, but I think people really get so consumed by this information because they just cannot believe that the way they've been living, 3 meals a day, we all eat, it's such an intimate, integral part of our lives. And then to realize that it seems to be 100% upside down, wrong, and backwards is
crazy, isn't it? Absolutely crazy.
It's very hard to contemplate.
See, I love the way you describe this as being like the Wild West when you described science nutrition, because I guess as a journalist, you get to look into other forms of science. I know Gary Taubes says, he was looking at physics before he went into nutrition. And in physics, it very much definitely, I think, is set up differently. Whereas in nutrition, it seems like opinion, fact, all kind of get mixed together, things get dropped out, people come in with their own opinion about things. And I guess one of the problems is that clinical trials on actual human beings over a long time is really difficult to do, isn't it? You know, you've got people to try and control what they're eating over a long period of time. The expense of doing that, the sort of processes must be incredibly difficult to do. I know it is possible, but it must be very, very challenging.
It is. And it's sort of the common, I think, explanation for why dietary advice is so hard to come by is people say, well, we just can't do clinical trials in nutrition. And that is one of the reasons we need to rely on epidemiology. It's one of the favored arguments of epidemiologists. But I have to just push back against that a little bit, which is to say that, you know, after President Eisenhower's heart attack, there was massive amounts of money that was poured into huge randomized controlled clinical trials, that kind of science that is hard to do, but does show cause and effect, by governments all over the world. This, you know, the United States alone put in at least $1 billion, and they ran long-term clinical trials. They did them in mental institutions where you can control people's food relatively well because you are actually feeding it to them. So you don't, you know, people are not cheating because they're in an institution. You can't do those kinds of experiments today because they're considered unethical. So there have been large, long time randomized controlled clinical trials done. However, they've sort of been lost. I mean, in the sense that they have never been used to inform any of our dietary policy, because when they came out, they did not show what all the scientists of the day, I'm talking about in the 1960s and 70s, everybody's convinced by Ancel Keys, and these results of these experimental trials come out and they don't show what people want them to show.
So get rid of them. That's it. Gone. Don't.
Right.
It's
because
shocking,
what they're showing is dying higher rate of people eating the margarine and soy-filled milk and soy-filled, you know, whatever the version of Impossible Burgers was back then. They're not being spared heart disease. They're not dying any less from cardiovascular disease. They're dying at higher rates from cancer. They are. I mean, these were, and in some of the trials, they had higher death rates. So these were not the results that people wanted to see. And so, as you say, you know, some of them were not published, others were buried, others were published 17 years, you know, one was published 17 years later, and even that did not publish the full results of the study. So that was called the Minnesota Coronary Survey. And when they finally unearthed the last results from that study, only recently from the computer tapes that had been left in the investigators' basement, they discovered that the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the men and women lower their cholesterol, the higher their rates of heart disease. So these were what we call, you know, science calls inconvenient findings, where they contradict the prevailing dogma, the reigning hypothesis. And so they're not believed, they can't be tolerated, people can't reckon with them. And that's what happened to the clinical trials. So, and then what happened was there was such a disillusion with the clinical trials. It was like, well, they don't work because they didn't show what we wanted them to. So
they must be damaged. They must be broken. The trials.
So we can't do trials because they don't show us what we want them to show. So I think that there was a little bit of a sense of disillusionment with clinical trials. But, you know, to speak in favor again of clinical trials, there have been, especially in the last decade, a lot of really excellent clinical trials that have been done. Some that have lasted, you know, quite a long time. And because it's getting easier now, even though we can't use, say, people in mental hospitals, it's easier now because, you know, you can wear a continuous glucose monitor, and that information can be sent back to the study. You can step on a scale every day that sends your weight directly to the, you know, investigator's computer, and you can have your ketones measured or whatever it is. So there are easier ways to measure adherence now or to get data in real time.
Amazing. That's so much better than to know. And I'm really glad for that. Although we will come on to in a moment some people who still use epidemiology to back up their theories. And we can talk about why they do that, because I think what people do is one question, but why they do it is quite often motivations are very interesting as well. So we'll come on to that in a second. But I've got some questions now for you. Now, this is a little round, if you like, about the evidence. Okay, so I'm willing to have my mind blown here, and I'm not expecting you to go into like exact papers published on certain dates, nothing like that. Just want to talk about these different topics and what the evidence, or is there evidence behind these different ideas? Okay, so the first one is, what evidence do we have for the Mediterranean diet being healthy?
There is one large trial called Predimid, which showed a very small cardiovascular benefit. So if you look at the absolute reduction in risk, not the relative risk, but the absolute reduction was 0.2% in cardiovascular events. That was the trial done in Spain. Wow. Right. And I'm just going into a little more depth here. That trial did not reduce red meat, and it was not low in fat. It was not a low-fat Mediterranean diet, which is the kind of diet that is prescribed now, at least in the United States. There have been other studies that show the Mediterranean diet help you lose a very small amount of weight. And the one meta-analysis that I know of, looking at all the data on Mediterranean trials, shows no benefit for cardiovascular disease.
Wow. Can I just ask you a question there? You said it was done in Spain. Was it only conducted in Spain, that particular trial?
The Predimid? Yeah. That's the famous Mediterranean diet study that landed on the front page of all the newspapers. That was conducted in Spain.
So that's the one Spanish example is for everyone in the Mediterranean, supposedly, like people in Italy, for Greece, for Israel, for North Africa, for Cyprus. I mean, it's only one country they look at. So isn't it a weird term? It's called Mediterranean as well.
Well, that's, one of the original problems with the Mediterranean diet, which is that there is no one Mediterranean diet. There's a variety of cuisines around the Mediterranean, and to say that they're mostly fruits and vegetables is just not remotely reflective of how they actually eat. They're all cuisines that are fairly heavy in meat. I mean, different kinds of meat depending on the country. More lamb and Greece, and so there was always that problem from the very beginning. Ancel Keys was actually the person who introduced the concept of the Mediterranean diet, and he recognized that in his Mediterranean diet cookbook, which he published with his wife. He said, "Look, it's impossible to have only one Mediterranean diet." But another interesting thing is that the Mediterranean diet was never meant to be a low-fat diet, and there was a fierce battle that went on between the researchers in the Mediterranean and those in the United States, principally from Harvard, who were pushing the low-fat, because they were in this low-fat mindset.
What a mess!
Imagine
this is such a mess.
That a higher-fat diet could be healthier. But in Greece, the most famous researcher there was arguing. She was saying it was because of the higher fat that it was healthier. All the olive oil. So. Yeah. It was what we think of the Mediterranean diet. Our American version of it is really not like what they eat anywhere in Europe, and nobody in the Mediterranean really eats like each other. They have their own distinct diets. So that was a commercial concept that was that was promoted by the European Olive Oil Council, which, if you want to read about that fantastic story, that's a really interesting story in my book.
Amazing. I love that.
I'd love to go into it more.
Well, I was going to say that I do remember my mind was kind of blown as well when you talk towards the sort of second half of your book about olive oil and its actual history with regards to the ancient world, and was it really a food source or was it actually a cleaning source? And I didn't know any of that. Okay, I knew about the Romans and the ways to sort of bathe themselves in oil, but yeah, it was kind of shocking to realize that it's actually a modern concept, the thought of eating so much of the stuff. I thought it was amazing.
Yeah, it was used to make your muscles shine in ancient Greece, if
you've got muscles, that is. I don't have any to make them shine, but
well, whatever you had. And then there was it didn't become a food. It wasn't consumed as a food until the mid to late 1800s, and that's because it was less expensive than the alternatives. But there's always the cooking fats had always been animal fats, lard, and suet and, and tallow. I mean, those were always the cooking fats, and butter in the West, of course.
Yeah, of course, definitely. Okay, so that's the first one. The second example, I'm going to ask you now, what's the evidence for a vegan diet being healthy?
Well, almost zero. There have been several small clinical trials that have shown no benefit. There was a recent meta-analysis done by the world famous Cochrane group, which does meta-analyses, and they showed zero benefit, or there was insufficient evidence to show any benefit of the vegan diet to protect against cardiovascular disease. There was one trial that compared a vegan diet to a low-carb diet that saw no benefit for either one. They both did equally well, but that was an uncontrolled trial. There was not a third arm of a control, and that's it. There really has been no randomized controlled clinical trial of the vegan diet showing a benefit.
See, it's what I find really interesting talking to you is that we're trying to talk about the scientific studies, and yet I feel like we're also talking about belief systems that don't match the science, which I find really interesting, because so many belief systems are being passed around about what's good for our planet, what's good for our bodies, and yet you just need to get to the evidence every time, don't you?
It is, I think, a rather strange phenomenon that we're living in this moment where there's such a strong belief in the vegan diet for health, not to mention the planet, that has no rigorous evidence base. So the entire evidence base for the vegan diet is that weak associational science that we talked about, epidemiology, that shows a very tiny association between veganism and better health outcomes, but very small. And they're contradicted by other epidemiology that shows that eating a vegan diet leads to worse bone health and greater risk of breaking your bones because it's a nutritionally insufficient diet. So you're not getting enough, vitamins, calcium in order to keep your bones strong. I mean, one would presume. So all of the evidence all the evidence against red meat is based on these weak associational studies. And so, as I said, Harvard with this, these databases, Harvard is Harvard, and all their associations turned out to be wrong when they were tested in clinical trials. So, I mean, what are the chances that these other associations are actually true?
Suddenly correct, when they haven't been before. Didn't I see in a talk you did that it's only about 20% accuracy in associational trials, that the actual accuracy rate is incredibly low? So
the range that I usually is the data points we have are 0%. That's the Harvard epidemiological findings. That's one paper that just looked at Harvard. And the 20% comes from a paper by John Ioannidis, who's a Stanford professor, who looked at all epidemiological studies and found that.
Right.
So not just Harvard, and found that their confirmation rate, in other words, how many could be confirmed in clinical trials, was 20%.
Wow. Okay, that's shocking, isn't
it? Neither of those are really good odds for the public health.
No, exactly.
I mean, imagine saying here, I'll give you this pill, and it has a 0 to 20% chance of doing you any good, and in fact, it may do you harm. We don't know.
But 20%, it's worth it.
Yeah,
take your chance. Okay. Well, the next one then. What is the evidence for meat-based diets being good or bad?
So, as I just said, the evidence showing meat to have an unhealthy effect is all based on this weak epidemiological evidence. And we can add a little further detail there, which is that the association, sometimes associations are very strong. Like in the case of smoking and lung cancer, it showed that heavy smokers had a 10 to 30 times more likely chance of getting lung cancer than never smokers. Okay, so that's 20 to 30 times, those are big numbers. The kind of numbers that we see when we are talking about red meat and colorectal cancer, which was what the WHO found, the WHO, the number there in terms of the association, what's called the relative risk, is 1.17 or 1.18. So just compare that, where 1 is no association. So you're talking about 0.17, 0.18. Those are tiny, tiny numbers. when you look at the criteria for, looking at an epidemiological study and asking yourself, can we infer causation from this study? The number one criteria is, what is the strength of the association? So here we're looking at associations that are very, very, very tiny.
Yeah.
So, and it's already low quality evidence because it's epidemiology, which only shows associations. So that's the data on red meat. I mean, the most comprehensive review of red meat and health was done by a team. They published their papers in like 5 or 6 papers in the Annals of Internal Medicine, a very prestigious journal, in the fall of 2019. And their conclusions was that they looked at cardiovascular outcomes, that's heart disease, cancer outcomes, any kind of outcomes having to do with diabetes and heart, like what they call cardiometabolic outcomes. And they could find, they said all the evidence was, there was a very small amount of rigorous evidence. The evidence that did exist was of very low quality. They just said there's really nothing you can say about this evidence to show one way or the other. And so their guideline was, do what you want, because we can't tell you otherwise. There's no evidence to tell you otherwise. But what is the evidence? What is the argument to eat red meat? And that's not something that commonly gets talked about, because it's just sort of assumed you can get rid of red meat. Why not? Save the planet, be good to, don't kill animals. And that would be, it's just a no-brainer, and there's no cost. But what is the cost? I mean, the cost is that red meat is one of the most important sources of heme, iron, and vitamin B12s, which we have both in the UK and in the US. There's almost epidemic levels of deficiencies in those vitamins. And, heme, the kind of iron that your body absorbs comes from animal sources. Like, you can't absorb as well, or even at all in some cases, the kind of iron that you can get in spinach, for example, or you need 61 cups of spinach and it's not as bioavailable. So, and B12, again, comes in red meat, comes in liver is the richest source of that. It also comes in shellfish, which most people can't afford or don't have access to. So you need red meat to get those incredibly needed nutrients, not to mention all the other B vitamins that exist in red meat, and folate it's another nutrient. And it's it's a cheap, available, and low calorie source of protein, a complete protein. So with all the amino acids all together, so you can eat, 125 calories of, say, beef, or you have to eat 800 calories of rice and beans, because you have to combine those, a legume and a starch, in order to get all the amino acids that you need at the same time in order to make a complete protein. So you have to think, like, the way to think about eating is like, well, how do I get the complete nutrients that my body needs to live?
Yeah, and how did I evolve as well, right? Because we didn't evolve mixing together legumes and starches and everything to try to make nutrients. It's there in the source, which is there available, and our ancestors would have just eaten it straight away. So it's interesting, we're trying to move away from evolution in this.
Yeah, I mean, there is somehow, it's maybe not a particularly nice thing to say, but it is a kind of creationist view to think that humans actually ate the foods in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
Ate fruits and vegetables. That's kind of a biblical view. And, but if you using science and if you look at what evolutionary biologists will write about, I mean, it's very clear that humans evolved eating meat. We evolved eating meat and pretty much only meat, or meat and fish.
Well, these brains couldn't have grown, could they, with just vegetables? There's no way that we'd have just been eating tubers and vegetables and grown a brain like we have. Because, I mean, if you look at the guts of gorillas, if you look at the guts of herbivores, their brains are smaller, their guts are massive, and yet we have this huge brain and a gut that's much more designed for meat.
Right. I mean, there's an interesting theory that when people say, well, we have small mouths, and and how could, and it's partially because one of the theories is that we evolved by when you could finally cook meat. When we developed fire and we could cook meat, and it's the cooking in the meat that creates greater bioavailability of the nutrients in meat. But again, it's about getting the nutrients that you need and getting them in a way that is calorically efficient. So you can eat a half a jar of peanut butter, but you're not getting all the nutrients that you need, and you're eating thousands of calories. So like eating meat is a very efficient way to get the nutrients that you need. And it just, as I said, like yes, you can have shellfish if you can afford it. If you have access to it, you can get needed nutrients. You can get in fish. You can get some in eggs. You really do need actually red meat, because white meat, like chicken, is relatively nutrient poor. So anyway, that's the probably
Amazing.
too long argument for
no, not at all. As a carnivore, I appreciate this. I really do. Okay, the last one I've got for you then, and this one I didn't know actually until I spoke to Gary Taubes. So I want to explore this a bit more with you now. What's the evidence that salt is bad for us?
So that again comes from associational studies. Gary knows the science on salt a little bit better than I do, but I know that there are sort of competing associational studies, and no, I'm wrong about that actually. So there were the DASH clinical trials that showed that lower diets with lower salt could reduce blood pressure. But those DASH trials were, first of all, they're all short-term. Like I think there was one that was maybe longer than 2 months, but they were pretty short-term trials. They were all on hypertensive middle-aged adults. So that's that's not representative of the total population, even though U.S. News and World Reports puts the DASH diet as like on its cover of best diets. It's only been tested in middle-aged adults with hypertension. I mean, I think there's one study on adolescents in Iran that was done, but otherwise it's really not been tested broadly on the general population. And in the DASH trials, they found that although they lowered your LDL cholesterol, which is supposedly your bad cholesterol, they also lowered what is known as your good cholesterol, lowers your HDL, and it usually raised your triglycerides, which is your fatty acids in your blood. So those are signs that you're increasing your heart disease risk by going on the DASH diet. And so those are not good signs, or it shows that the DASH diet has mixed effects at best. And then there's epidemiological studies that are very clear that it really seems as if there's a J-shaped curve, and that if you go too low on salt, your cardiovascular risk goes up, particularly if you're a normal person without hypertension. And if you eat too much salt, then your risk also goes up, but that is mainly restricted to people who already have hypertension. So that going too low is really quite a risky thing. And we're talking about sodium, not salt. But going too low on sodium or potassium seems to increase risk. And the science, I think, is fairly clear on that. But I know it's disputed. And part of the problem of getting clear science on that is the same problem with what we've been talking about on saturated fats, which is that this low sodium diet idea was adopted by the American Heart Association, decades ago. There's a lot invested in it, and it's been sort of institutionalized, bureaucratized, and it's very hard for the more current science to kind of wedge its way in there.
Yeah, amazing. I went to an event in Parliament a few years ago, and they had different stalls set up by different charities and organizations. And one of them said, we want to get rid of all sugar. And I thought, yep, I can agree with that one. And salt. And they were just put in the same category together. And I said, well, hang on a minute. There's no reason to eat sugar. Your body makes sugar yourself. However, depending on what you eat, you need more or less salt, depending on what your diet is. And they're different things. And I find it incredible that they're just lumped together because it's easy to do. And I think it's kind of sad, because I think the amount of people suffering with low salt intake must be quite huge because of this reason.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they lump together sugar, salt, and saturated fat as if they're all somehow like
all the same
bad things that you can't eat. But
what's left? What's left in your diet then? If you take those three things away, what do you have? Just fiber? I mean, that'd be an interesting diet.
I mean, it is very, and I think that it's quite serious, the fact that we're giving advice to have low salt diets, including in the US, we're enforcing low salt diets on children, no data on children, and we're enforcing this diet on people for whom it's very clear from quite a lot of evidence, or let's say it's suggestive, that diet is probably harming them. And you know, once you have your sodium potassium out of balance, I mean, it really does lead to some pretty serious effects in terms of cardiovascular risk. So, you know, it really is, it's again and again, we see this situation where there's, you know, we live in sick populations, and populations that are getting sicker and sicker, and chronic diseases on the rise. And the main issue seems to be that we cannot get the best and most current science into our policies, because there's so much resistance for many reasons, because of the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, because there's cognitive dissonance, because of people's careers have been invested in erroneous hypotheses. I mean, there's a whole confluence of forces behind this, but it's still a public health tragedy that the science and the information on many of these issues exists, but it just cannot be adopted into policy due to these rigidities.
Yeah, it's actually tragic, isn't it? And it seems also sad that, you know, you think about Democrats and Republicans, or in this country, Conservatives or Labour, holding office and being in government, and yet these sort of behind the scenes policymakers aren't changing, or the ideas are still the same, and the parties don't seem to be able to control or change things. I mean, how is it going to change? Is it going to change from grassroots movements, like, you know, people like listening to this podcast and, you know, trying to petition their MP or stand up? I mean, what power do we have to make a difference here?
Oh, you know, I give this subject a lot of thought, and I do not think there's a single answer. I think there is a bottom-up groundswell of people who are recovering their health, and they are increasingly, they're finding like-minded people, and they're speaking out, and there's just this enormous, now millions of people around the planet. And there are efforts to organize those people. And I know, you know, I have a nonprofit where we tapped into some of that energy, and people were writing thousands and thousands of letters to senators and congressmen. And so I think there is, I think that those bottom-up forces will be felt eventually. And I think there's also a kind of paradigm shift going on in nutrition science, where some scientists are starting to speak up and are starting to, you know, they care about science, and they do not want to see sort of they want to see better science being done in their field. Like, this is their field. So they just don't want to see it sort of being turned over to various special interests and ideologies. So, you know, I think, I mean, my hope is that some combination of these forces will eventually help turn things. I mean, there's just, and you have to think that, you know, there are certain, I mean, although it seems like everybody's invested in the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger, and nobody can beat the pharmaceutical companies because they're so powerful, and, you know, they're certainly not interested in improving health. But there are a lot of large, in the US, there's self-insured companies. They pay for their own health insurance, and there are an increasing number of sort of enlightened CEOs who are understanding that if they can change the diet or change their wellness advice, they can actually make an enormous difference in their workforces. So we're starting to see some of that happen. And I think we're starting to see some professions like military or the airlines, where, you know, they have hard outcomes, right? I mean, you know, they are not a doctor's office where the doctor can say, like, oh, you're getting sicker and fatter every year, and I'm sorry, I'm doing the best I can. But, you know, in the military, you cannot be sicker and fatter and not be able to, you know,
defend your country
or fly a plane, or, you know, you just can't. Yeah. So like they have to have a more rigorous approach to the science. So I think there are various points of light that are potentially coming together. And I will say, undergirding all of this is that there is just a growing amount of really good science being done. Good. I mean, in the sense that there's more and more clinical trials. There's, you know, clinical trial on on the low carb diet and depression. There's a clinical trial on low carb diet and fatty liver disease, and and a low carb trial that was on Alzheimer's, which showed outcomes that are better than any medication, including the one that was just approved by our Food and Drug Administration that was shown to have almost zero benefit. But so I think, the science will continue to grow. That's another point.
That's great.
Try to be optimistic.
You know what? I'm so optimistic because the reason I said at the start of the show is because I wanted to try and encourage that grassroots movement by sharing all these N=1 stories, which I'm not a scientist, I'm not going to do my own trials, but at least I could share these stories where people said, actually, I put my type 2 diabetes into remission, or I lost lots of weight on this, or I was able to have children for the first time. My fertility issues were, reversed, or whatever it might be. I think the more we share that and realize that actually there's more and more people realizing this is a problem, I think that's also optimistic. So anyone listening or want to share your story, please do, because it could inspire somebody else to make them realize they can change their lives. And that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? A positive change for the better for all of us.
And those stories are, undeniable. I think that even though there are some issues of science that we just don't have our own ability to test, right? How do I know what causes air pollution? How do I, it's very hard for me to know exactly what's causing global warming or the changing weather. Like there's much of science is inaccessible to the common person, but the average person can test and change their diet. They can do their N=1 experiment. They can see what works for them. They can fiddle around with, macro ratios or whatever it is, and they can do their own experiment. And although science says that these individual anecdotes are not science, and they aren't in the sense that they, it's not a controlled clinical trial, but when you have millions of observations of people doing something that is supposedly impossible, say reversing their diagnosis of diabetes, that is, that then becomes data that has to be reckoned with. I mean, it's like saying, I have a million people who jumped out of an airplane without a parachute and didn't die. Well, what? So, I mean, how did it happen?
Yeah. Tell us about it. It's amazing. You can't
deny that those scientific those are observations that you need to explain them.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's so true. Okay, so the Nutrition Coalition, you just mentioned it back then a little while ago. Before we go on to our last part, which I want to talk about this debate that happened a couple of years ago, can you just tell us a bit more about your non-profit organization and, what can people do to be part of it, or, what sort of work is you're working on at the moment?
Yes. So the Nutrition Coalition is at nutritioncoalition.us. And it is the only group anywhere in the world that is trying to change dietary guidelines. It started in 2015, and it really is the only group that is documenting what is going on, that is writing about it, is trying to educate policymakers. It's trying to, it's bringing sort of attention to them. As I said, we were able to kind of stimulate thousands of people writing in. We were able to encourage the first ever outside peer review of the dietary guidelines by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.
Wow.
That was a spectacular report that came out. And then we followed up by getting Congress or encouraging Congress, I should say, to be sure that the part of government that is responsible for the guidelines, responded to that report and had to say what we're doing, what we're not doing. And then there was a follow-up to that now happening, another study by the National Academies of Sciences saying, like, why do the dietary guidelines not better address diet-related diseases? So we're trying to bring pressure to the dietary guidelines to basically do a better job, or to be more accountable.
Excellent.
So I think, we have no industry funding at all, and we are supported entirely by individual donors. So, I mean, it really is, and because the US guidelines are so influential and considered the gold standard around the world, for better or for worse, I guess for worse, I mean, please do donate, because we really do depend upon, people like you.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think, you know what, if you get it in America and it then changes, then of course Britain's affected, the European Union's affected, we will all be. This is what I find incredible at the moment. The sort of the post-war consensus in the world, I guess, is that America leads the way on so many of these policy areas. And actually, if America changes, then we change. A bit like when you get when you sneeze, we get a cold or whatever. It's exactly the same in terms of this scientific advice, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of an old legacy that really, in terms of nutrition, we certainly don't deserve. It just it's an unfortunate thing. I think the whole world would have been much better off if there had never been any nutritional guidelines, because ultimately what they're a way for food companies to make to get their foods in there in the dietary guidelines. I think in the UK ones there was actually like a can of Coke on your plate that you had for a while, and it's a way. It's a feeding trough for these food companies.
The free market wades in.
Yeah. So it doesn't, and they haven't benefited the health of the people. So, and they're sort of captive, or at least in it seems in the UK, and it's certainly true in the US, that they're captive to the large multinational food and pharmaceutical companies that benefit from them.
Yeah, shocking. I think this is the thing I found shocking about your book as well, is that, I kind of expect that big food and big pharma is going to be there for its own profit. That kind of makes sense to me. But I always have this ideological belief that democracy holds governments to account, and that means that they will do the best by us. So when you find out that governments have absolutely failed us, that's kind of heartbreaking, because you think, well, hang on a minute, what do I do then? I kind of distrust these companies, but I should surely have faith that democracy works. And it clearly has let us down here, hasn't it? Well, democracy hasn't, but the governments have.
Well, I mean, when you look at, like, we're all cynical about the military industrial complex, and we know that that's all been captured by corporations, but many of us have still sort of grown up with a faith that government does, and it does do certain things well, but there are just areas that have been captive or are unable to change and grow with science. In some ways, one thing that helps me to understand this is that I think that government and science is a little bit of an oxymoron, or institutional science, because institutions need to be constant and not flip-flopping on their publics, and not because they feel like they're conservative. They don't change. Bureaucrats have no incentive to change, or to really wiggle the status quo at all, and they even be liable for having given the wrong advice. So, and then science is the opposite. Real science is supposed to be self-doubting, self-questioning. So, being able to be flexible, shift with the observations. And so I think entrusting our this important science to large bureaucracies has just been, maybe it's necessary, but it seems like it's a mistake, at least in this case.
Yeah, it's really, I think you're totally right there. Totally right. Now, I know we've been talking for quite a while, so are you okay for time for a little bit longer? If I just go through this debate you had a few years ago.
Sure.
So okay. Now I watched this. What I think probably a lot of people. I'm going to let you into a little story here. So I was reading your book, and I was really kind of getting into this book, and I thought, who is this Nina Teicholz? I don't know anything about her, so I literally thought I'll go on YouTube and I'll see if you've done any talks. So I know you did some, like some keynote lectures and things at different low carb conferences, and then there's this debate that came up, and of course I'm in politics and I love debating and I love the whole kind of format, and I thought this will be really interesting because you were an opponent to David Katz, who I didn't know anything about either. I just literally watched this from a very neutral point of view as what's going to happen. And I'd love to find out, by the way, what the backstory was to this debate, because I'm sure there's a story there too. But what was interesting was, so David Katz was asked to debate the question about, is there, I think, the quality and the quantity of evidence to suggest that a plant-based diet is healthy for us. I think that's kind of paraphrasing what the motion was. And he kind of started by saying that effectively it was a sand trap, that he was kind of almost like he's making out as being manipulated into a position where he couldn't argue, which I thought was very interesting, because like the spokesperson said, anyone could have changed the title of the debate and they chose not to. And he kind of used this victim position to then argue with lots and lots of studies, and he did kind of a bombardment of evidence, which was very hard to actually pick apart because it was just one picture after another, after another, after another, after another. And it was really, I thought, really underhand a tactic to use, where he used ad hominem attacks against you. He didn't actually answer the question because the surveys he was giving, which you then questioned, he kind of skated through really, really quickly. And I've got some quotes as well I'm going to go into in a moment, which I'm going to pick apart. But I just found it a fascinating experience. And I was actually so tempted to actually send you a message saying, I've just seen this. I can't believe it. I was kind of horrified, but I thought, she doesn't know who I am. Why would I? Why would she would go, who's this guy? But I was kind of shocked by it. So do you want to tell us a bit about the backstory behind this debate first, and then just your point of view on it, and then we can talk about some things he said that I'm shocked by and I want to pick apart.
Yes, reliving that moment. Well, so let me tell you.
I'm really sorry if it's reliving. It's bad. I'm really sorry.
No, it's totally fine. I actually I'm not experiencing any PTSD. David Katz is a really unique character on
Can I just say, stop there a second. If Nina Teicholz falls out with you, you're a very polite person, because the way you just said that was so diplomatic. I was going to say he's a very special person. Okay. Tell us more. Sorry. He's unique. Okay.
Even before, so here's how I became aware of David Katz. Before my book was published in 2014, there is a hostile attack on me in an online website that doesn't exist anymore, the Huffington Post, by a David Katz who like calls me, names, and it's like an ad hominem attack, and it's not dealing with any of the science, and it's just like this really nasty column about me. And then he proceeds to write another maybe 15 columns about me, and calling me a parasite of science, I mean, every nasty thing under them. Only a journalist. I'm only doing this to make money. I mean, these are well-known tactics, right? You accuse your opponent of having financial motives and not being interested in the science, and you attack their credibility and their credentials. And so he is doing this, just relentlessly attacking me. And I sort of discover, I'm curious about him because, of course, like, who is this man? It turns out he operates like this, although he operates some kind of research center that he calls the Yale Research Center, but upon some examination, you realize like it's like half an hour away from Yale and doesn't have anything to do with Yale, except for somehow he has the Yale title. And then that even the Yale title kind of disappears because, I inquired with the dean of Yale, and he's like, yeah, I don't really know why there's the Yale in that title. Anyway, so he had started all these companies that were designed to profit, for-profit companies that were based on sort of plant-based diets. And he was the spokesperson for Juice Plus, which was, he just had like all these financial interests. He took $750,000 from Hershey's chocolate and Quaker Oats and all this money, a ton of corporate money behind him. So, and he ran an advocacy group, which was designed to sort of shoot down anybody who did not believe in the plant-based diet. So so he's like this. He's kind of an advocate, and he's sort of this, and he works with a lot of industry, and then he did, I can't remember now what it was. He did something that was so nasty towards me that actually a bunch of doctors ended up writing Yale. And so then the Yale Daily News, there was a column on him in the Yale Daily News about his bad behavior towards me. And then, I don't know, there were so many, and then he was what is it called? He was a sock puppet reviewer of his own novel, and that was also outed by the Yale Daily News, where he called his novel like, as if it had been written by Aristotle. It couldn't be better. And then, so he's just this. He's I don't really know what
unique.
he is, but
he's unique.
He's unique, and he's this strange attack dog of a person. He has very close connections with Harvard. Like, most of his companies had been started with Walter Willett, who's the former head of the Harvard School that the same school that publishes the science we were talking about. And he was close to Dean Ornish, who's a vegan diet doctor who was also involved in his companies. Anyway, there was just, he seemed quite powerful and very well connected. Anyway, so we get set up in this debate, and
who did the debate? Sorry, was it like a college approached you, or did one of you suggest it?
No, it was run by a libertarian group, and I'm forgetting the name of it. But they do a debate series in New York, in New York City, and they do it. They do mainly debates that are not on nutrition. We were an exception. They're run by somebody named Gene Epstein, who used to be an editor for financial magazine Barron's, and he had. He's interested in this subject because he had lost 50 pounds by changing his diet, and he was interested in the topic. And of course he's absolutely meticulous, Gene. That's why I couldn't believe Katz's opening line was that, oh, I didn't agree to this title, because like every single word of that, we had like multiple email exchanges and we had agreed upon it. And every time I made a suggestion, Gene was so meticulous. He's like, I'll go back. I have to ask Dr. Katz and make sure that's okay with him. And everything was very meticulously set up. So that was a complete sham argument by David Katz.
And it's obvious, by the way. It's obvious because there's no way you would turn up to debate where the question's set up to trip you up and you wouldn't question it. It's almost like turning up to a sports match and the rules have been changed for you. It just wouldn't happen. It's got to be fair for both sides.
And you agree. There's two debaters. It's not. You agree to. You sign up for it. So there you are. Yeah. And even if you think the question is unfair, you've agreed to something beforehand. And the question was, is there any rigorous science to support a vegan or predominantly vegan, whatever, predominantly vegetarian diet? And you and I answered that question earlier today. And so we and because there's no science, he went through, as you say, this like rapid fire drive-by kind of list of studies that he couldn't stop. It was like this. Each study you could barely read the title and it was gone. And later on, I was not clever enough I'm sure you'd be much clever as an experienced debater.
No. I think you did a great job.
I'm not an experienced debater, but to me, in retrospect, I think it's like, if you had gone to your English teacher with your thesis or something, or your paper, and just dropped the whole thing at his or her feet and said, this is a brilliant paper. And, the teacher's like, well, how do I know? I can't read any of it because like, I don't know what your argument is. And I can't read
Just move on. Give me an A and then let's move on.
Yeah.
Just trust me.
Scientific presentations, there's like, there's a study. Here's the title. Here's the results.
Yeah.
Here's this, with that. So I've done plenty of presentations to scientific audiences. So he was, what he did was just manipulative, and it's because he didn't have any evidence. And I happened to like catch one of the studies that went by, and I said, like, this is a study that I actually know and is routinely used as the most persuasive argument behind a vegan diet, and that's a study by Dean Ornish. And I said, and here are the problems with that study. It was multifactorial. It was only on 40 men. They had 2 deaths in the vegan diet group versus 0 deaths in the other group. So I actually knew that study, and that's the one that he sort of had actually paused for more than a second on, saying like, here's particularly good. So there's no evidence there, but that was his tactic. And it was the only way he could win that debate. I have no idea why he agreed to it.
But it kind of works in a way, not at that level of the debate, which I think anyone who, I would love to know, for instance, what the chair thought of the debate, because, that's somebody who's educated, who understands how debates work, would have actually have looked at the evidence and gone, hang on a minute, it's a bit fishy. But unfortunately, when you look at that now on YouTube, there are some people on the certain tribe, and they're going to say, yeah, he proved it, because that's what it looks like. And it's manipulation. And that really angers me, because that's not a real debate. That's not real evidence. There's one thing he said that I almost choked when I heard it. And he said, this proof here shows that a plant-based diet is as effective as a statin at reducing your cholesterol. And I was like, whoa, where do we start on that? That's that's a belief system again, isn't it? That he was using to say it's as effective as a statin, but like statins are good. So, you know, there was that kind of side of things. I've got some quotes here, if you don't mind me. I don't want you to like go to like relive some of this stuff, but it's just some of the stuff he said that I was really intrigued by. He said, if I toss this apple up, it's going to fall back down and not float away. So I guess the evidence was very strong. Was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it meta-analysis? See, I think science is being abused and misused. I think the most robust evidence is remarkably consistent patterns at massive scale on obvious display. So effectively, he's saying that the only science that matters is looking at epidemiology and looking at this kind of causation and correlation and assuming they're the same thing. He's basically making those arguments exactly the same as Ancel Keys, isn't he?
Yes. And in fact, he and his group have come out with like a new method for evaluating science, which elevates epidemiology to the highest spot. Like they're trying to rewrite the rules of science. They're trying to actually, you know, there's various methodologies for evaluating science around the world, and they all agree that randomized controlled trials are more important than epidemiology. But now David Katz and his friends are trying, including his friends at Harvard, are trying to just rewrite the rules of science to say, nope, our science is because it supports our point of view, is we're going to rank it higher.
Yeah,
and so
you just have to believe in it.
That is actually, you know, they've published that protocol in a journal and they're trying to promote it. I don't know how far they'll get, but I think when he threw up the apple and he let it drop down, he was like, look, and this is one of his lines, like, it's so easy to solve diet-related diseases. This is easy as this, you know, why are we making such a big deal out of this? And, you know, what I wanted to say was, which I didn't, but I think I didn't have time, but if it were that easy, why is obesity still going up? Diabetes going, you know, why do we have epidemics of fatty liver? Like, if it's that easy, are we all just incredibly stupid? Are we, you know, what's wrong with us that we have, you know, now 60% of our population at least with one of these diseases?
Yeah, exactly.
You know,
and actually, I think you did point out that we are eating now less meat than we were before. We're now eating more vegetables than we were before. So actually, you know, the evidence that he was saying should make us healthier is actually happening. We are eating more vegetables. We are eating less meat. So why, in that case, if that data is correct, is his argument proven to be so utterly flawed when the diabetes is going up?
You know, if you point that out to, in fact, that in every single category regarding that's been measured in terms of what we've been told how to eat, like, you know, fruits and vegetables up 25 to 30 or 35% in terms of consumption in the United States. Meat is down by 28%. Beef is down by 35%. This is all since 1970. Yeah. You know, grains are up by 40%. Vegetable oils are up by almost 90%. Fish is up. In every category, I'm not cherry picking here. In every category you can find, we have done as we've been told. So actually, we're not that stupid. Yeah. But what have been the results? They're just not what we would have expected or hoped for. So there has to be something wrong. There has to be something wrong with the hypothesis about what is a healthy diet. But I mean, the reality is that people like David Katz and his many friends, they simply ignore that evidence. In the same way that when evidence came out that contradicted Ancel Keys' hypothesis, the evidence that comes out that contradicts this now favored plant-based diet, it is ignored. I mean, it's consistently ignored. In one case, David Katz's group actually tried to get those papers in the Annals of Internal Medicine that I mentioned on red meat, that were that was such a rigorous review and had been, they actually tried to get those papers retracted before they were published. So, I mean, talk about extreme measures of trying to silence the science. Did I say that?
All I'm going to say is, I think, and all I think in the end is that surely the truth will out. I mean, I hope into that, you know, as a kind of optimistic person, but I just hope the truth will out eventually, because, you know, you kind of think that this way. Well, I do anyway. I can't believe that falsehood and lies would last forever until somebody says the emperor has no clothes. You know, and that's what I think we're going to get to, that point eventually where all these people are going to fall by the wayside, because the truth is the truth, and it's not personal. It's not used as a weapon. The truth should just be what it is. And if science did that, and some of the humanity stuff got out of the way, if science literally just found the truth, then I think we'd be all better off, wouldn't we? And it seems so simple in that way.
I do. I think I would have had more confidence in your statement, maybe even just 5 years ago. I think that now we're living in just the most bizarre times where we're sort of required to subscribe to certain ideologies, and the truth is being suppressed. Like, I was just reading an article yesterday about how in some medical schools in the US, that medical professors are being harassed for using the terms men and women and referring to binary sexual,
Yeah.
and the words he and she, because it doesn't take into account other gender possibilities. And so they're being harassed, and in some cases there are petitions against them. So there are forces, kind of ideological forces so contrary to science that are currently that are sort of rising and have so quickly become very powerful. And I think that they have in their crossbow the subject of red meat and the science of red meat, which is that to say you're in favor of red meat is considered sort of a political heresy now. If you're if you're a proper liberal progressive, what we would call liberal progressive, and you believe in doing anything possible to save the climate, and you are on board, you're on board with a number of ideological positions or just policy positions, and one of them is not eating red meat. Eating red meat, there's been an effort to politicize it and to say, oh, you're eating red meat means you must be conservative, anti-science. You must have a gun. You're one of those people. You probably have a red pickup truck. What is wrong with you people? So there's just it's a kind of politicization, and meat has gotten caught up in that silencing of conversation, or the contracting space for real conversation about a number of topics, including in science. So I just don't know what the future holds, like, in this environment.
I totally agree with you there. I think in a way, social media has amplified that, hasn't it? Like a catalyst that people share their views, but also it's almost like in the post-religion age for the West anyway. I'm not saying about the whole world, but religion has gone down so much, but people still have a need for tribal belonging, don't they? And they have a need for wearing the badge that says, this is me and this is the tribe I belong to, and these are my values and my beliefs, and here's the list of things I signed up to. And actually I still think most people have a sense of, well, I agree with some things in that area, some things in this area, something, I just think life's so much more complex and nuanced than that. But social media means you only get to see the extremes sometimes.
That's true. We've certainly become, and I think for whatever reason, there's the forces that seek to polarize us and push us apart are stronger than the decent human forces to find common ground and to listen to each other. And that's truly, it could be the end of civilized, enlightened society, really, as we know it. I just think we're living through a moment in history that we really don't know how it's going to write itself out.
Yeah.
But my hope and prayer is that red meat and animal foods will not be so politicized. I could care less about my diet versus your diet or whatever. I just think I don't want people for their health to be ruined. When I think about all these young girls who are now vegan and the problems that they may have with autoimmune diseases, being unable to, have healthy children, healthy babies. It really could be a tragedy of just unbelievable proportions if we cannot speak up on these issues.
And I think you're right. And I think that's exactly it. We might not know the impact of what's going on now until 20 years or so. And that's the worry, isn't it? And it's too late for those people then. So I just want to say, Nina, I know you've been here for a long time. I really, really appreciate it. I've learned so much, and it's been a personal privilege for me to be able to meet you. So even though we're doing it virtually, But it's been great. And yeah, I wish I'd sent you that message now to say, I just watched this debate. I can't believe it. But I have now told you in person what I thought. So yeah, so thank you for taking in that debate and you know, and having, in all honesty, a conversation with somebody on the opposing side. You know, you did something that most of us never do, and I think that's really commendable, and it's brilliant. And even though it's a bit of a sand trap in some ways for, you know, for you as much as him, I thought you did really well, and it's brilliant. So thank you, and thank you for your book.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on your show. It really has been just wonderful to talk to you. And so, you know, I hope to see you soon in person. May the barriers between our countries fall. May we all be able to travel and give each other, you know, an embrace some time in the future. I hope so.
Excellent. All right then, Nina. Take care. Bye now.
Bye-bye.